Awesome.
Okay,
Perfect. Hi,
so
everyone. Jeremy, I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction to Wetlands Week,
perfect.
and then I'll let you take the floor and dive right into the presentation. So before we begin, I just want to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we're gathered on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This land, known as Mi'kma'ki, has been the site of human presence and activity for thousands of years. As we discuss important environmental issues today, like wetlands, we'd like to acknowledge that the Mi'kmaq people are the original stewards and knowledge holders protecting and respecting the environment. So my name is Mimi O'Hanley, and I'm the Wetlands and Water Coordinator at Ecology Action Center. And I want to give everyone a warm welcome to day 3 of the second annual Wetlands Appreciation Week. This year it's taking place from August 10th to 18th. Wetlands Appreciation Week is unique to Nova Scotia. This week is a collaborative effort from about a little over a dozen groups who have come together to host some great events across the province, including guided hikes, webinars, and interactive activities. I'm going to post the link for the events that are happening this week here in the chat. Definitely take a look at that if you're interested in learning more about wetlands. There's things in person and online and for all age groups and all interests. So please do check that out. Today is actually the first of 2 webinars being hosted this Wetlands Appreciation Week. And in fact, this presentation is an encore presentation from a similar one that took place last year during Wetlands Week. So folks took such a shining to wetlands and to Jeremy talking about wetlands on barrens that we wanted to continue to celebrate these unique ecosystems with a second webinar this year. So less than 3% of the land area of Nova Scotia consists of what are called barrens, but these are a high priority area for conservation due to their presence of rare plants and vegetation types, as well as the impacts from recreation activities. So today I want to welcome Dr. Jeremy Lundholm, a research associate with TransCoastal Adaptations at St. Mary's University. And he's going to be discussing barren landscapes, their biodiversity and origins, and the presence of important wetlands within these landscapes. So today's webinar will begin with a presentation on the topic, and then we've allotted about 15 minutes at the end for questions. At that time, you're welcome to put questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll call on you to unmute. During the actual presentation, please do keep your mic muted. This session is also being recorded, so we're going to look to post it on YouTube shortly, so you can look out for that. So huge thank you to Jeremy for being here today to discuss this topic. I'm now going to pass the floor to you, and we can dive right in.
Great. Thanks so much, Mimi. It's an honor to be invited back to do this again. And yeah, happy Wetlands Week, everyone. So my name is Jeremy Lundholm. I apologize for the state of my voice, but we'll give it a go. I am a botanist and plant ecologist. I currently work for CBWS, an environmental consulting firm that specializes on wetland restoration, and also for TransCoastal Adaptations, the SMU Research Center, also focusing on all things coastal wetlands. But I'll give you a bit of my background, how I got into barrens in the first place, because that's where my main research expertise lies and what I've mainly focused on for the last few years. Let's see if I can get the slides to advance. So I got started in Ontario. I did my PhD on limestone barrens around the Great Lakes, but focused on Bruce Peninsula National Park. If you've never been there, I really encourage everyone to visit. It's a beautiful park, and the barrens there are pretty special, especially if you have an eye for little tiny plants. And so this is what I was studying back then, looking at biodiversity, looking at species diversity patterns across these barrens, and also looking into how these barrens are maintained over time. So that's one of the key things with barrens ecosystems. The term barrens, of course, is a misnomer. They're really high in biodiversity. It's definitely not the case that it's a place devoid of life. It's actually the opposite. But to the untrained eye, they can seem quite different, especially when we live in forested biomes where, by and large, the dominant sort of natural vegetation cover is forest. And so when you have something that isn't forest, it gets a different name, right? So I got my start in Ontario, moved to Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki about 20 years ago, and started studying different kinds of barrens, but primarily focused on the coastal barrens. And I will get into some definitions in a sec, but these are areas like what you see at Duncan's Cove and Chebucto Head, based in Halifax at St. Mary's. I spent, basically we'd go to the closest barrens we could to save travel time. So I really started developing a feel for these systems around on the coast of just outside of Halifax. And that's one of the amazing things about Nova Scotia is that, you can drive half an hour outside of the biggest city in the Maritimes and be in a fantastic, natural setting. Just beautiful. Anyway, we'll get into it. um, so working on barrens off and on and being distracted by other things like green roofs and coastal wetlands from time to time. All of this work on the barrens sort of culminated in something we published in 2020, which was the first barrens ecosystem classification, and primarily looking at plant communities as sort of the basics for dividing up the landscape into different types of habitats. And I'm still working on this today. So we've updated that classification. We're working on getting the updates published. There's something like almost 40 different distinct plant communities now recognized on the barrens. And I think there's 20 some odd published in that 2020 version, but so we're still working on it. There's a lot of number crunching, so I won't get into the details of that aspect of my work. Today, I'm going to focus on wetlands that occur within the barrens. But first, we're going to define what I mean by a barrens in the first place. So I'm a plant ecologist, and the ecological definition of a barrens, it's a kind of landscape. And a landscape from an ecological perspective is an area that includes multiple types of ecosystems that sort of share a space. And the multiple types of ecosystems on barrens typically are not dominated by trees, and that's why overall it's a barrens, not some type of forest. But within a barrens landscape, you can have all kinds of different ecosystems. So we've got, like I said, wetlands. We'll talk about those today. But little patches of forest, little patches of trees, as long as it's not a complete forest, then we call it a barrens. Various types of shrublands, and it's the shrubs that really make up the dominant sort of vegetation in the Nova Scotia barrens. And so that's where we're at. And so what captivates me about barrens is that diversity of different types of vegetations that you can find in a single place. It's also the sheer aesthetic beauty of these areas. And I'll get into some of that stuff. For me, it's really been a personal journey. I love these ecosystems. And, on a good day, I pretend to be a scientist, but really my favorite thing is just to hike through the barrens in all the different seasons and observe what I see and enjoy it. Well, Nova Scotia, despite, as Mimi said, there only being sort of 3% of the land area of the province. Currently, they are found throughout the province. There's only a few areas that don't have a lot of barrens. The green diamonds here actually represent places where my team and I have collected data, mostly not me, mostly others, but so these diamonds are all factoring into that classification project that we did, that we've been working on. And the yellow areas are really areas that have a significant amount of barrens in the province of Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, more than or close to 50% of barren area in Nova Scotia is already protected, mostly in provincial level designations like provincial parks, nature reserves, and wilderness areas. However, as people that work in these situations understand, there's not a lot of enforcement available in some of these areas. So there is still damage, even though formally protected. There are still threats to barrens, even though many of them are enclosed in these areas. Over the years, we've come to recognize that there's sort of three main types of barrens that we find in Nova Scotia. And the first is coastal, and those are probably some of the best described. But there's also inland barrens that are really important as well. I'll touch on that a little bit. Coastal barrens tend to have the most wetlands as well, so we're really going to focus on those today. But highland barrens are those found in the Cape Breton Highlands as well, and these are really interesting, and they have some of our most rare plant species, especially when we get up into the alpine zone, which is a whole different set of habitats, which is very interesting as well. Talk about that briefly. We've also got urban barrens, which I'm really keen on. I mean, it's not a discovery. I'm sure people have known about this for years, but I didn't. Just off the peninsula in Halifax West, there's this great set of sort of wild shrubland adjacent to some community gardens and some lawns that somehow has escaped, being managed or anything like that. And it's got some of our key barren species in there. Nothing rare, but just really cool to find this sort of wild barren habitat in the middle of the city, including things like crowberry and three-toothed cinquefoil, some of our great native sort of barren plant indicators. So I'll talk about some of these plants later, but it was just really cool. So, starting on the coast, looking at some of these coastal sites, many of you have been to these places. And Chebucto Head is a good one. I was leading people to this site yesterday at Polly's Cove, where there's this white pine that's basically growing horizontally. So when you talk about coastal barrens, one of the most important things is the harsh coastal conditions that maintain these systems. So yesterday when we were out, at first when we got there, the site was enveloped in fog, which is one of the key things. If you're reading the literature about sort of coastal barrens, they talk about fog as a really important factor that maintains these almost Arctic communities in an otherwise temperate environment near sea level, right? So we're not up in the Alpine where you get extreme conditions of wind and all that kind of stuff, and just cold temperatures because you're high up. This is sea level, but we've got issues with salt spray and harsh, like strong winds from the coast. So fog is one factor, but when it's not foggy, it's often windy, right? So fog and wind are almost opposite conditions, but both of these sets of factors are helping maintain treeless conditions or conditions where trees really struggle. So this horizontal white pine is a classic example. This is a picture taken in the spring where you can see the red needles are actually evidence of salt spray causing damage over the winter. Winter storms are more severe and they bring more salt farther inland compared to what we see in the summer, even with hurricanes. So it's just it's a seasonal factor that affects our coastal barrens. You get crazy growth forms of trees that are super interesting. This is a hemlock, an eastern hemlock tree near Duncan's Cove. This is not a plant you see often right by the coast. I'm not sure how it got there, not sure how long it's been there, but it's highly stunted by the coastal barren conditions. Probably a factor of wind and just not that much snow cover in the winter and really harsh conditions. So these are part of the recipe that explains why you get a coastal barren in some sites, and in other sites you get a forest coming right up to the ocean. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. Here's an example where you do get basically forest growing almost to the edge, where you can see bare rock here. And then if you go a little bit farther to the left on this photo, you're into the Bay of Fundy essentially. But there is this narrow strip of what I would consider a coastal barren vegetation. Looks like there's a bit of impeachment here. So there's black crowberry, and there's a coastal meadow. There's grasses as well that are the native grasses typical of that coastal environment. And so it just goes to show there's still, even when you have lots of soil built up and you can have a forest, you can still get a strip of coastal barrens vegetation right by the coastline. But that other ingredient, that other part of our recipe for why you get a coastal barren in some areas does have to do with bedrock. So part of the province, like for example, the Assapatagan Peninsula, doesn't have a lot of barrens on it. The whole thing is mainly forested, except where we've come in and developed settlements or whatever, roads and that kind of thing. So places, so you won't get a lot of barrens there. But on other peninsulas like the Chebucto Peninsula, it's a different kind of bedrock, right? The Assapatagan Peninsula has mostly glacial till, so it's easier for trees to get established, even if you're right by the coast. But in areas where it's granite bedrock, like a lot of the sites I've talked about already, Chebucto Head, all those kinds of areas, you do tend to get coastal barrens, especially in that coastal strip, just because it's that much harder for trees to grow because of the soil conditions. And there's Polly's Cove again, like we saw where I took people the other day. One of the things I like to point out for coastal barrens is that they're worth visiting all year round. there's always something interesting to look at. The color schemes that you'll see are very different in the winter compared to the spring. You get a whole bunch of these evergreen shrubs changing color, and they'll change to sort of red or purple in the winter, which is nice. I'll talk about that later. Um, but I'm going to talk briefly about inland barrens because they're important as well. And there's sort of two or three main types, depending how you divide it up. Inland rocky barrens are quite common, and we see some of these even right outside of Halifax. The McIntosh Run area, Purcell's Cove Backlands, has some great examples of inland rock barrens. From a sort of vegetation classification perspective, some of these are classified as open woodlands, which is basically a little bit more trees than your typical barrens, but still pretty rocky and open. And these are the jack pine open woodlands that we see there with broom crowberry in the understory, which is a really interesting and probably unique combination of species in the world. Broom crowberry is one of those shrubs that it's an Atlantic coastal plain species, and it is rare and often critically endangered in most of the jurisdictions, like, for example, in the eastern US, except for Nova Scotia, where it's common. So it's kind of neat that we have a common, like one of the rarest species in the world is actually common with us. It's not that rare, I guess, because we've got so much of it. But if we didn't, it would be highly endangered throughout its range. So it's an interesting species. So inland rock barrens. The thing with inland barrens compared to coastal is that inland barrens are typically understood to be maintained and created by natural disturbances, including wildfire, which is a big one. And so in 2010, we had that big fire in Purcell's Cove, or Herring Cove, whatever we call that area. And it really opened up that forest. And there was a lot of renewal of those sort of low growing barren shrub species, including rare things like the Hudsonia ericoides, which is the woolly heather, one of the heather species. Golden heather, I think, is a common name for that. And lots of regeneration of the broom crowberry as well, which you don't see very much in the absence of fire. So that was really interesting. So I'm going to go back. The other main type of inland barren is sand barrens. And we've got some endangered plant species that live there. That's the Canada rock rose. And I don't study that directly, but it is restricted in our province to that kind of habitat. I think I've got some pictures later on, especially of the habitat itself. It's another disturbance-driven system. Primarily fire is the thing that likely maintains that. And in the absence of wildfire and in the regime of fire suppression, you get a shrinking of those barren environments. It'll be interesting with climate change, with now we have more wildfire, whether we go back to scenarios where like in the 1700s and early 1800s, where up to 20% of our province was covered by barrens, and a lot of that was driven by big disturbance events, like hurricanes, and then subsequent wildfires and stuff like that. Lastly, I will talk about highland barrens in terms of our types. We've got some amazing highland barrens. These often have similar plant communities to our coastal barrens, so a lot of those dwarf shrubs, a lot of those creeping, just low-growing plants, very tundra-like environment. And again, what is maintaining these as open habitats where, we're not typically high enough in elevation to have true alpine. Although if you go to Cape Breton Highlands, you definitely see a tree line. So there actually is, harsh climatic conditions partially maintaining this. But there's also a fire history in the highlands as well. And so some of these main barren sites have burned, even if it's over 100 years ago. And part of the story of these barrens may just be, super slow recovery from those a fire event, plus add to that sort of moose disturbance, eating, regenerating tree seedlings as they go. And you've got a very complex environment, but nevertheless, lots of really cool plant species, lots of amazing sites up there in the highland barrens. So let's get back to the coast. And I'm going to start talking about wetlands soon, I promise. But these are just some of the dominant plant communities that you'll see on our coastal barrens. And I think probably the most distinctive, and I mean this sort of in a global setting, are the dwarf heath communities. So these are dominated by low-growing shrubs. They're in the heath family or the blueberry family. It's the same family, it's just different names. Crowberries, blueberries, cranberries, huckleberries, all members of that family. Typically, the dwarf shrubs don't really include the huckleberries, which are a little bit taller. So we'll consider those to be the shrubland communities, whereas the crowberry dominated communities are the dwarf shrub communities. To me, these are globally important because it's only in Nova Scotia that you start to see these more Arctic type communities occurring at sea level. If you go up to Newfoundland, of course, there's a lot more of these types of communities, but it really starts here. As you go farther south, places like Maine do not have a lot of these. And so it's really unique because you've got this species, black crowberry, for example, that is typically an Arctic or alpine species. But here we have it growing at sea level. And so it's a testament to our climate and our coastal conditions as to why it actually exists and why it's actually the dominant in some of these systems. Now, black crowberry itself also grows in wetlands. It's a bog species in our province. But if you go to central Canada, you will not find black crowberry in any abundance until you get up way up into like around James Bay and Hudson Bay, those kinds of areas, because it really is at least a subarctic kind of plant species. So this really stands out as a unique environment here. And it's one of the, it's just one of the components of the biodiversity of these systems. Here's a close-up of what the black crowberry looks like in summer. But of course, these aren't monocultures. They're communities that are mixed with other species coming in, like the junipers and a bunch of other shrubs here and there, and other interesting species coming in as well. So other types of communities we see on the coastal barrens are more of the taller shrub communities, and these are very abundant as well. They're typically more abundant than the coastal sort of dwarf heathlands a little bit, but I'll show you some maps that actually quantify this. But these are common as well, and these have a whole bunch of species that you'll find in there. You can see the rhodora flowering here. That's our native azalea, which is common in the wetter parts of these barrens. So far, I haven't shown you any of the wetland communities. So these are, even if they're sort of wet, they're not wet enough to be wetland. We've got some of these larger expanses of these shrubby communities. So this would be a black huckleberry slash sheep laurel shrubland community. You can see a lot of bracken fern in here as well. That's a really common one. The black crowberry is really common throughout our province, and it's not necessarily restricted to barrens. Of course, you'll see it in forest. You'll see it in forest edges. And it is a species that responds positively to fire as well. So when we see a big barrens that's dominated by huckleberry, it's not always clear if this is sort of a long-term barren or if this is just a forest that is taking a long time to reassert itself as a forest again after some kind of disturbance. But on the coast, the closer you get to the coast, the more likely it is that this is going to be a longer lasting barrens kind of shrubland. And that's just because of the harsh coastal conditions. We also have what we call meadow communities. And so meadow, from a plant classification perspective, meadows are dominated by grasses or other herbaceous species, not by shrubs or other woody species. So again, the dominants in our coastal barrens are the shrubby species, but as you get closer to the coast, you get these little meadow bits cropping up, and some of these are in the rocky areas that are highly impacted by salt water in the form of wave overwash and salt spray and stuff like that. These are highly tolerant species. Some of the species like seaside plantain or the seaside goldenrod, you'll also find these in other salty environments like salt marshes. But yet others are really restricted to coastal barrens in terms of where they grow their habitat. Roseroot is one of my favorites. It's a medicinal species. It's used across the Arctic medicinally. It is really more of a far north sort of subarctic species. You don't see it a lot at sea level, except in Nova Scotia and of course farther north in Newfoundland, but it's a really cool plant. It's named because the rhizome that it grows out of, that's more or less underground, does have a compound in it that smells like rose. And I believe that's some of the medicinal properties are from there as well. So it's these really neat meadow communities right at the shoreline where you're getting a lot of wave overwash. There's another coastal meadow. Sometimes these meadows can be large, especially when there's a history of grazing, like in Lewisburg, where there would have been sheep and other, sort of human introduced grazers. I should mention as well that our coastal barrens, as well as probably our inland barrens and our highland barrens, were likely inhabited by the caribou, the woodland caribou that used to live in Nova Scotia that went extinct in the late 1800s. And so part of what we see on barrens today, we're not seeing the historical, we're not seeing what, would have existed for thousands of years before Europeans got here. It's an altered system. We're not sure exactly in what ways it differs, but a key grazer is now missing from our landscape, and that's the caribou. And we're not sure what impact, the loss of that species would have had on our barrens. The other thing we see in coastal barrens is tree islands, and these do provide an interesting aspect to the biodiversity. There's certain plant species that will only live in the understory of these tree islands. So they do add to sort of the landscape level diversity. Here's some of the rarer species that we do see on coastal barrens. These are some provincially rare species. Vaccinium uliginosum, alpine bilberry. Again, an Arctic alpine species that occurs at sea level at a few locations in Nova Scotia because of those coastal conditions. Golden heather, if you were out on the barrens in late June, you could see this flowering. Paradoxically, although it's rare, it's associated with disturbance, so you often see it on the sides of paths as opposed to sort of in the more intact barrens. So that's an interesting one. Here's some pictures of the sand barrens. They're broom crowberry dominated. This is the main sort of dwarf shrub species that will live in those environments. And I don't have any rock rose photos for you, but this is sort of what they look like. And tree encroachment is a big issue for these barrens, especially because they haven't been burned in a while. Here's just some other examples of the inland rock barrens. You can see this white coloration here. These are cladonia or reindeer lichens that are super common in inland, highland, and coastal barrens. They're a really interesting component of the biodiversity. There's a bunch of different species that live there, and they are sensitive to disturbance, especially trails and things like that. It's one of the first things to go when you put a trail through a barrens, that kind of thing. More inland rock barrens just showing trees that have been burned and recovery of the lower shrub vegetation and tree recovery as well. So this is that same site I showed you earlier that burned 10 years ago or 14 years ago now. But yeah, so it's part of that natural cycle of disturbance and regrowth. One of the other rare plants that we see on inland rock barrens is the mountain sandwort. It's not as rare as we once thought because we're finding it in more locations, but it does have a really sort of unique niche. If you've seen it when you're hiking, it always grows in these sort of granitic, open, very dry, but seasonally wet depressions. It's a really neat little species, and it's nice to see barrens. The highland barrens are characterized by, like I said, a similar set of species, but they have some unique characteristics as well, like these frost-sorted rock fields called felsenmeers, which are really neat and have the unique communities associated with them as well. Like I said earlier, climate conditions play a big role here. So maybe not so much in terms of hurricanes, but les souhaite winds in the highlands can basically create hurricane force winds. And so you've got extreme wind playing a role in these environments as well as lots of moisture and lots of fog. So those are key components. When I take people on hikes, one of the things that I notice, especially on the coastal barrens, is they're very fragrant. The plants release compounds that you can smell, and the main species that do this are the black crowberry. So when you see that community, you will smell it first often. Junipers and bayberry, those are the sort of the three keynote scents that you can find on the coastal barrens. Color-wise, I mean, when it's summer, it's the flowers that are really showing up and providing a really interesting visual picture. Unfortunately, yesterday we didn't see any of the bog orchids because it's too late. But if you want to see them, go to the barrens in June, and there's amazing displays of orchids in a lot of our coastal barrens. Fantastic. In the fall, you see a lot of our deciduous shrubs. So those would include blueberry and huckleberry being the real dominants, changing color and dropping their leaves. Some years better than others in terms of the vibrancy of colors, and that's due to a bunch of climatic factors. Basically, the weather leading up to when the leaves are dropped make a big difference. It's the same with sugar maple and other plants that drop their leaves and make colors. But yeah, so and in winter, you get a whole other suite of plants that are providing color, and that's the evergreens that, we call them evergreen, but in fact, many of them turn other colors in the winter. And these are protective pigments that the plants are producing to shield their cellular apparatus from high light conditions, but with cold temperatures. So basically what happens is the temperature is what governs how quickly a cell can do stuff. So when it's cold, the plant can't do things as quickly, and basically it can't assimilate the light that's coming in as quick. And so it has a more tendency to damage the cells because it can't do what it can do in the summer. And so what it does instead is synthesize sunscreen in the form of these purples and bluish darker compounds. And so you'll see this in the winter, this panoply of different colors in the evergreen species. So it's pretty neat. Some years are better than others as well. It just depends. And of course, we've got berry plants that many of the shrubs that you see on barrens do produce berries. There are animals that will eat them, but this is also a source of joy for humans as well, because we can pick them and eat them. Some are better than others, of course. Just a few of the berry plants that we see. And of course, other culturally significant plants, maybe not the main habitat for sweetgrass, but we do see sweetgrass showing up in some barrens. It's more of a wetland species, but other interesting species that are just, maybe some people use are things like smooth holly, which is a southern species that we find at the northern limit of its range in our coastal barrens. So I really got to get into the wetlands, so we have time for some questions. But so up to probably 14%, at least on our coastal barrens, of the land area is actual bogs. So bog wetlands, various kinds of peatlands that are related to bogs. And that's where you get these orchids. That's where you get these wonderful, this is Polly's Cove, the big pond, and winter scene here, showing a lot of the lichens that you can see. The reason we can actually put a number on how much wetland there is in coastal barrens is a study that one of my students started about probably 7 years ago now. But this was right when the drones became cheaper and drone cameras became more sophisticated. So we basically took drone imagery from 3 sites. We took these 500 by 500 meter squares at sites like Chubbucto Head, Prospect. So this is south of the High Head area, but closer to the village of Prospect, and one of the parts of Polly's Cove, and took aerial imagery and then classified the imagery based on spectral characteristics, so color, texture, things like that. This is the Prospect Bay site. Lots of dwarf heathland, as it turned out. So lots of that crowberry community we found there. And basically what we're able to do, using a combination of field work to kind of ground truth what the images were showing us, and fairly sophisticated computer algorithms to classify this vegetation, what you end up with is a map of the different kinds of vegetation on the barrens. And so I am guessing you can't read these tiny fonts. So I'm just going to talk about some of the wetlands here. So this sort of dark yellow color here, this is all bog wetland. So this is sphagnum dominated peatlands. The bright green is another type of bog, more dominated by Myanthemum trifolia, which is the 3-leafed false Solomon seal. These plants have terrible common names. And so there, you can see at Prospect Bay a lot of wetland in that habitat, in the overall barrens landscape. The dark green here is that dwarf heathland. So there's a lot of that crowberry community there. And you can see here the original images that were used to put this together. There's a lot of these open rocky habitats as well, dominated by lichens. That came out as really important. Almost 10% of the land in some of these sites. Here's the Polycove site, again, broken down into those different communities. So it's a different mix here than Prospect. And you can still see some of those wetlands. So these larger bogs are showing up just at the edge. And there's other wetland types as well. If you go closer to the coast, you'll find some salt marshes and things like that too. But really, if you compare this to the actual image, you can see that the distribution and sort of shape of the rock outcrops really drives what plant communities you're going to get at a particular site and where those plant communities occur. It's kind of obvious, but it's really nice to see it laid out like that. It just maps right onto that. So here's all three. We changed the color scheme. It's supposedly a colorblind friendly color scheme. But in any case, it's a little bit less contrast in for some of them, but you can see sites like Prospect have a lot more wetland, or at least bigger patches of wetland, whereas the wetlands are divided up into a lot of smaller chunks at Polly's Cove and Chebucto Head. It's the first time we've done anything like this, and it was really able to tell us, you know, what plant communities are living side by side. So that was part of the analysis we did. For example, where do you find tree islands? If tree islands are expanding, you know, with climate change, if trees are becoming more common, where are they spreading into? What kinds of other plant communities might they be replacing? So that's kind of useful in terms of conservation and management, because now we can say for sure that, oh yeah, they're spreading into this community or that community. So that's been interesting. Communities like Owl's Head is a great example of how the topography of a site drives what communities you get. Owl's Head, luckily, is now, I think, going to be protected, from what I've heard. But it's got a really unique set of ridges, and on the tops of those ridges, you get one community, which is the broom, crowberry, black spruce, and in the hollows, you get wetlands, right? And so that's sort of the dominant thing that we see, and those wetlands are largely peatlands in those cases. So here's sort of an overview of all the different types of wetlands we see. Again, dominated by open bogs. These are the most common. Black spruce bogs, also pretty common. You get these little bits of black spruce trees coming into those bog environments. We do have some salt marsh environments as you get closer to the coast. They are tidally influenced, so you have to have direct connections with the tide. Whereas up here in these bogs, these are completely cut off from, you know, other water sources. They're essentially rain fed for the most part. You also get ponds, so open water habitats, which are common. These are probably really important for biodiversity. I know there were some researchers studying frogs in these a few years ago. So those are interesting as well. They also have a unique suite of plant species that live in ponds and not elsewhere. For example, water lilies. So some sites only have a couple ponds that have water lilies in them. It's the only place you'll find them on those sites. Good thing those ponds are there. You wouldn't have those species. Some of the other interesting communities that we've picked out over the years are not obviously wetlands, but are kind of borderline. So cinnamon fern is one of those species that we see on coastal barrens, and it's really neat because it tracks the drainage, the natural flow of water through the ground. Even if there's not open streams, if you look on a hillside, and especially in the fall when they start to change color, you can really see the cinnamon fern, and it tracks where the water is going underground, which is kind of neat. So here's some examples of salt marshes that are close to the water on some of our barrens complexes. This is the one at the tip of the Crystal Crescent Barren. So what is that, East Pennant? Yeah. So there's some actual nice salt marsh here. This is salt marsh sedge for the most part, I think is the dominant, but there's also some salt hay, some of the other key salt marsh grasses. They're not as common as some of the other wetland types. This is the one at Polly's Cove. We saw this yesterday. This is also dominated by salt marsh sedge. So it really is more of a high marsh community. I hadn't seen any of the low marsh species there. They might be there, but we'll have to do more detailed surveys. So This is what the salt marsh sedge looks like close up. You can see it. It even occurs in little bits, little pockets on the rock barrens where there's enough saltwater influence that, they can maintain themselves, but not very common. Open bog, we've seen pictures of this before too. There's a nice one at Chebucto Head, just perched right in there, with dominated by sedges in this case, as opposed to sphagnum moss. But these are highly diverse communities. There's lots of plant species. There's pitcher plants, there's bladderworts and sundews making up sort of our carnivorous plant flora. On barrens, you mostly will only see these in bogs. And they occur there because bogs are typically low in nutrients, and carnivory is one of the ways that some of these plants have figured out to augment their nutrient supply in a low nutrient environment. So basically by capturing insects and getting nitrogen and phosphorus from them, as opposed to the soils, which can be quite poor. But yeah, biodiversity wise, these are just fantastic. There's so many plant species that live in there. They're really neat. We don't have a ton of rare stuff in there. Bogs are fairly common in our province. So our coastal barrens aren't necessarily hosting rare bog plants, but they're there nevertheless. There's also these little pocket wetlands in between some of the ridges that host other species, like this wetland sedge, Carex folliculata, with the rather uninspiring common name northern long sedge. But they're there, and they're part of that. They're part of that landscape diversity. Here's more of a close-up of what the black spruce bogs look like. These grade right into the open bogs, so these are all part of the same habitat complex. Basically, there's tons, like I said earlier, there's tons of these on barrens. All you have to have is basically a 10-meter by a 10-meter patch of a wetland to qualify as a real wetland in the provincial legislation. So these are legit wetlands. We do have even smaller patches that basically look like little wetlands, but wouldn't make it, wouldn't qualify. But nevertheless, they all contribute to the landscape diversity and the functions of these habitats. Here's some of the water draining off the barrens at Crystal Crescent, and you can see the color of the water, the tannins or the fulvic acids, humic acids from bogs, basically from the bog plants leaching out. And it's just a beautiful thing that is part of our barrens as well as our bogs. Like I said, open ponds are really cool habitats, and there's a bunch of them. Very interested to see what happens in the winter with these. Some of them freeze over, some of them don't. Depends on how cold it is in a particular winter, but they'd be very interesting, I think, from a faunal perspective, just to see what animals are living in them, and how they survive over the years, and whether there's anything interesting living in those. We haven't done that work yet. It's wide open for other people to come in and do that. So here's a few of other key wetland species that are just really interesting to see, like the bladderworts. These are submerged aquatic carnivorous species that are really cool that we see on there. Here's the cinnamon fern community, and just showing some of the mapping my student did, just showing how they track. So the yellow represents where you find the cinnamon fern communities on, I think this is the Chebucto Head site. So it really is tracking the drainage in some areas, not all of it, but that was a neat one. There's also sort of borderline wetlands that, are somewhat wet. They really count as sort of wet heathland. And you get more sedges living in there as well. Not clear whether these are true wetlands, but they're wet. And they occur on coastal barrens because of those, poor drainage, lots of fog, and cool temperatures. Here's a few of the other species we find in our coastal barrens that are wetland species, essentially. Yeah, cranberries everywhere. I wouldn't even call it a wetland species. It's so adaptable. This species anyway, the large cranberry, but it does track freshwater seeps as well. It's kind of neat. And here's one growing right next to a nice little sundew, again at the edge of a coastal barren at probably Crystal Crescent, I think that one was. There's also these seasonally wet areas that we see. So some of these areas will dry up and make these sort of muck puddles. This is Baleen on Cape Breton. Some of them may be influenced by frost in the winter as well. So there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff going on. I'm going to wrap this up so we have time for questions. But you know, I won't get into the value, but basically wetlands are part of the biodiversity of barrens. They do provide valuable habitat. I haven't talked much about pollinators, but since there's a high diversity of floral resources on the wetland side of barrens, they're important for pollinators as well. And there's a hydrological function as well that I don't think anyone's really studied, but it's there because that's what wetlands do. They clean the water, they store the water. They're really important for, you know, the whole rest of the landscape. So, of course, we've got ecosystem services like the provision of edible plants for humans, all that kind of stuff. Some of the threats are ATVs, off-highway vehicles, can really do a number on especially the wetter parts of our barrens. And so this is just at Polly's Cove, some of the bogs that people have driven through. Only takes a couple of passes to really mess up that ecosystem. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I'll talk. I'm going to leave it here, but there is potential for rehabilitation and restoration as well. But I can talk about these later if there's time after, during, and after the questions. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to questions now.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was so interesting. If anyone has any questions, you can either put up your Zoom hand or just write it in the chat and we can read it out to folks. Yes, Nancy, I see your hand. Oh, I think you're muted. You just need to.
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for the hike yesterday. I had a couple of questions, and one was about whether all of wetlands are carbon sinks or just the peatlands type of them.
Yeah, I don't know the details. Salt marshes for sure. There, peatlands. Yes, I think the issue with peatlands is methane emission, and I'm not sure how much. I think it has to be studied on a case-by-case basis to really understand, you know, which of those peatlands are a net sink versus a source. And I think going back to the ATV disturbance, one thing we found was that comparing, you know, trails through bogs on barrens versus other habitats, it really increased the temperature of the soil. That's one thing we studied was soil temperature, and it really went up in those bog habitats. And that is probably going to be driving increased decomposition and we don't have the data, but could result in that wetland becoming a source of carbon, go back into the atmosphere. So I think it's significant. We never published that. It was a student study many years ago. And, but yeah.
Can I ask one other question? One of the things that fascinated me yesterday was when you were saying how some of the plants that are found in subarctic conditions are kind of at their southernmost point. And then some of the Arctic plants that were there that were, some of the southern plants that are at their northernmost point. And I was interested in, because I'm thinking about liminal environments and just these two meeting, and whether you've come across in your research any kind of indigenous storytelling or something that surrounds the meeting of these two areas, or is that something recent?
I haven't heard about it in terms of that kind of storytelling. But I would expect, you know, especially in salt marshes and places like that, which are really this, you know, meeting of land and sea, that those stories might be there. But it is a really interesting, I think it's an important part of the barren story in terms of the biodiversity. It's one of the interesting things that we have, you know, these species basically growing side by side that have these very different evolutionary histories where, you know, a temperate plant from the south versus an Arctic plant from the north, and here they are happily coexisting. I think it's neat. I don't know the real significance of it, but it certainly does seem to be one of the reasons why we have you know, that it is a fairly rich community in terms of just how many plant species we have that live there.
Thank you.
I don't know. That's all I
I
can say.
love it. I love the idea of the boundaryless, the merging. Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks.
I don't see any other questions in the chat or any other hands, but I have a question, and that's, do we know much about the groundwater systems of barrens?
We don't. Barrens have not really been studied from an ecosystem function or services perspective. And carbon storage would be an important part of that as well. And we don't know. I mean, because they're not forest, we tend to think of them, well, they have less biomass, so they probably have less carbon, which is likely. But the soils probably store a significant amount of carbon as well. But hydrologically speaking, it's tough. We just don't know. A lot of it is, you know, a coastal barren, for example, most of the drainage is just going to be out to the ocean. So whatever is happening to that water, as soon as it hits the ocean, it's kind of, now it's part of the ocean, right? It was fresh water briefly. So I don't know. I don't know what those connections are and what that importance is. But yeah, it's a big gap.
Yeah, I'd imagine that the groundwater system would be really interesting to learn about, to study.
I would
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
Pat has a question. Pat, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like.
Thanks, Jeremy. Quick question about, you mentioned at the top of the call that 50% are already in protected areas, but I'm wondering, when you start to break that down into the different communities that you've done through the classification, obviously we know sand barrens significantly underrepresented in protected areas, area networks, but are you finding other kind of more smaller communities are underrepresented, you know, from a land trust perspective from NCC? These are the kind of information we can use to help prioritize some of our acquisitions.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't speak to that, but what I can say, which is good news, is that the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center is now taking our revised classification, and they are going to be assigning conservation ranks to all of those habitat types, all those veg types. So within 6 months, I shouldn't say, within a year, we should have that information. So we'll know which ones, specifically which veg types are at risk. And I think it's part of their, and I'm not sure, as part of that, I'm assuming they'll be figuring out, you know, which ones are already in protected areas, because those would get less of a high priority, right? But a lot of it is occurrences, like how many instances of this particular type are there, and how widespread are they? So yeah, so we don't have a sense yet. Definitely just from looking at the data, there's certainly communities that are underrepresented. Like, we only found 5 plots that fit the description of this veg type.
Yeah.
Some of that is a sampling issue. Like, we haven't been everywhere, even though we tried. So we're hoping to resolve a bit more of that when the classification comes out. And the ACCDC is going to be figuring out the ranks. And so we'll have a much better sense of the rare stuff. But I can tell you right off, it's gonna be the inland and the sand barren stuff, as well, the highlands.
And as far as the mapping and distribution goes, is the resolution there to help identify some of these smaller community types province-wide, or just some of the sites you've been to?
It hasn't been done yet. It'll be interesting how much they can do with whatever provincial sort of layers they have. The barrens layer as it exists now, like what we've been working with, is way too coarse to get to any of this. And in fact, it's not great at even identifying, you know, what we consider to be barrens versus not. So it's not great.
Has there been any attempts at using LiDAR with the classification? I
don't know. I mean, the drone stuff that we did basically did that because we're getting elevation pings from all of our pixels, right? So we were able to do that, but LiDAR could help for sure, because the topography signal, the elevation signal, those were important structural components of our algorithms to actually classify the communities. But without imagery, without the spectral component, I don't know how far you can get with it. So yeah, good question.
Awesome, some great questions. We might have time for one more. I don't see any in the chat, or just checking hands quickly. I don't see any. But Jeremy, you were about to dive into some of the threats to barrens, and I would love to learn a little bit more of that.
Yeah, I mean, they're sensitive environments. And I think what we're seeing right now is there's definitely a climate change issue, and it's coastal squeeze. So some of those communities right at the coast are moving inland. So the coastal meadows are encroaching into the dwarf heath. So the Empetrum communities, are not as salt tolerant. So we're seeing tieback, but we're at the same time, it's a natural process. We're seeing colonization, if you will, by the Plantagos and the salt tolerant communities. So everything's shifting inland. The question is there always that accommodation space for those communities to shift inland? And will that same shift happen? Like, it's easy for the meadow to establish where there used to be the dwarf heath, but will the dwarf heath do the same thing farther inland, like to tall shrubs or to forest, that kind of thing? And we don't know that. We're certainly seeing, you certainly see tree dieback, but I think that's always been there. I don't know if it's increased. No one's measuring it, so we're not sure if those coastal effects are affecting everything. But the coastal effects it's erosion and salt spray that's increasing with increased storm severity. So that's one big threat. That's a new one, at least new in terms of us observing it. But the classics are, overuse of trails, trail braiding, mechanized trails, so ATVs and stuff like that isn't great. But hiking alone has an impact. And I think just a place like Duncan's Cove, where you see that braiding, especially in wet areas, I think just some simple management, not super expensive stuff, but just delineating trails and trying to, make better the trails that are already there, make them more suitable so that people aren't always trying to go off trail to get to a drier spot or whatever. Those kind of things could make a difference. I know there's a lot of issues with budget and even jurisdictional stuff, like for Duncan's Cove Nature Reserve, you're not supposed to have any infrastructure or trails, and there's no budget for maintenance. However, it's a used landscape, right? That's not going to change, but it doesn't fit within our protected areas scheme to have any budget for trails, as far as I understand. So there's issues there, but I think those are the top issues for me in terms of threats.
Yeah, that's really interesting, but not surprising.
No.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I think we're just at the top of the hour now. This has been so interesting, and thank you to all of our participants. Yeah, it's really great to have you here, and please do check out other Wetland Week events. I'm going to post the link in the chat again, just in case you missed it at the beginning. But other than that, have a lovely afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Mimi.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.